Well, let's get into the Civil War. This is 3A-2, Theme 1, Starting the War, Strengths and Weaknesses of Both Sides. At the outset of the Civil War, remember that Lincoln had vowed to preserve the Union and democracy. We talked a little bit, hopefully, about his personal goals as opposed to his goals as president, and they actually differ slightly. Secession was seen as a challenge to democracy. We see that in the Civil War, a minority of Americans, the Southern plantation owners, overwhelmingly white and wealthy, were dissatisfied with the election of 1860, and they attempted to break away from the constitutional government. They were afraid. They were afraid of losing their slaves, which amounted to about $75 billion worth of investment, and it prompted them to argue that the states' rights were going to be violated. Again, you can't understand the Civil War without understanding that it was a states' rights issue viewed through the lens of slavery. Now, the war began when the Confederates fired on Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina. The Union base, it was a Union base, and the Confederates tried to take it. When the Union tried to resupply the base, the Confederates started lobbing shells at the fort and the ships that were trying to resupply. The fort fell rather easily, and it was but no mistake. It was a trick by Lincoln in order to convince people that the South had started the war. The Northern Union soldiers left the fort and the Confederates took it over. But now we need to talk about the advantages that the North had. If we look at this chart, we can see that the North held advantage in the nation's population. It held an advantage in the nation's white population, which is important because those were the people, at least at the beginning of the war, were eligible to be soldiers, especially in the South. And we have to be careful not to fall into the trap of the myth of the black Confederate soldier. It never really actually happened. The proportion of the national railroad, they had more railroads, which means they can get their supplies around quicker. More farm acreage, which is surprising to many people because the South was an agricultural area, but you have to remember they're growing cash crops like cotton, not staple crops like wheat and corn and such. Had a higher proportion of the nation's manufacturing, had a higher proportion of the nation's manufacturing output, had a huge advantage in the number of factories, which means that's the number of war materials that could be produced, and it had a huge advantage in the number of railroad miles, which again can get things around the country faster. All of this material advantage makes it seem like the North should have had a fairly easy time to take control of this war, but it's not really going to be that easy. They had all of these advantages, including they had a navy which could dominate the ocean, or at least in theory it could, and it allowed larger and better equipped fighting machine. It doesn't guarantee victory. The South had what we are going to call King Cotton. They assumed that because their cotton manufacturing was so important that Britain would support whatever manufactured war goods were needed. The British would eventually ally with the South and provide a navy for the Southerners, for the Confederacy. This was based on their long history of a traditional trade relationship with the British. And the Union understood this as well, the Northerners. They attempted to counter this King Cotton strength in two different ways. The first was the Anaconda Plan. This was a blockade around southern ports to try to disrupt trade. They would also try to split the South in half. This is slightly off. What they wanted to do was split the South in half right here along the Mississippi River. That would keep Texas, Louisiana, and Alabama from being able to supply the other states of the Confederacy. Then they would try to take Richmond, which is here in Virginia. The Anaconda Plan was great in theory, didn't really work all that well in practice. We'll talk about that in a second. The Southern strategy was fairly simple. They wanted to pretend it was like the American Revolution. They wanted to fight a defensive war and keep the war going on as long as possible. And in this analogy, the South would be like the colonial Americans, and the North would be like the British power, trying to be the aggressor. What the Southerners wanted was to keep this war going until the North got tired of spending their blood and treasure, and then eventually they'd go away, just like the British. The British still had a technological and economic advantage over the Americans during the American Revolution. However, they got tired of wasting blood and treasure and eventually went away. What the South was waiting for the entire war, and in fact we're going to see this with the attacks at Antietam and the attack at Gettysburg, the South was trying to have its Battle of Saratoga moment, having that one big victory that would convince a foreign power to ally with them. They were constantly looking for that alliance with the British, and the British are going to be kept away. They wanted that turning point. The Confederacy assumed that if they had kept the fight going long enough, eventually the British would join them, like the French had joined the revolutionaries. The British would help the Confederacy provide money, provide navy, provide extra soldiers, and this would influence their decisions throughout the war. It led to the Battle of Antietam, which backfired because it allowed Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. We'll get on this more in the next unit, or the next theme rather. It also allowed, in Gettysburg, that essentially cost Lee his army in the war, and it allowed Lincoln to issue the Gettysburg Address, which for a large part reaffirmed the goals of keeping the Union together and freeing the slaves. Now, initially, the Confederacy had better military leaders, and they had home field advantage. They were fighting mainly in the South, a defensive war. Robert E. Lee was a very effective leader. He gets a bit overstated at times. He actually had a higher casualty and attrition rate than Grant, who's often considered a butcher. But the biggest advantage that the North had was actually political leadership over the South. This is Abraham Lincoln. There are many things said about Lincoln. We're going to talk about a few of those as we go through this presentation. But we're going to deal with that in our next theme, Lincoln, the Emancipation Proclamation, and the African Americans.